War and Peace, game of the Napoleonic Wars, published by One Small Step, a game based on one of my favorite books, which is Leo's Toy Store by War and Peace. The game is based on a war game that came out several decades ago, game by the same designer, same title. I didn't play that one because I didn't know how to read yet when it came out. Also, combat odds, too complicated for me, so I cannot compare, but I can tell you about this one. The game can be played by a solitaire player or by multiple players if that's an opportunity that you have. But I played the scenarios that I tried all by myself, controlling all sides of the confrontation at the best of my possibility. So definitely a game that is very friendly to the solitaire player. It can be played that way, no problem. Also, the back of the box may scare away some potential buyers because it says that the complexity is very high. Luckily enough, that is partially untrue. The game comes with many scenarios covering different sections of the Napoleonic era and then a large monster epic campaign game. The high complexity only applies to the campaign game, which is not just a lot longer than the scenarios, but also, yes, more complex with a lot more stuff going on, many more rules. But if you plan to play the scenarios only, the game actually is very approachable, very simple and elegant, and definitely can be played by a beginner war gamer. And I haven't played a campaign game because I'm at a point in life where I simply don't have the time and the mental energy to devote to that. When I retire and my kids are adults, then I'll definitely play the campaign game and I'll let you know about it. So stay tuned, mark your calendars. 25 years go by faster than you imagine, so make sure you're around here in 2045 and you don't miss the second part of my video. Now, as for this game here that we have here, and based on my experience of playing these scenarios, not the campaign game. The game is played on this absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, and very large double map. It's two large mounted maps. Really takes a large area, but it's totally worth it. You will need even more table space than this because, as I'll show you, really will want to use the leader displays. We'll see what that means. But look at the beauty. It's all here. You got the whole sandbox. The game is very sandboxy. From Portugal to Russia, the entire theater is here. We even got Egypt. Look at that. And a display for world naval operations. Amazing. You got a large number of counters. I got just the main French and the English out to show you how the game works. These counters are thick, very high quality, very nice art. They're glossy for the main part. There are 5 counter sheets, and at least in my copy, for some reason, 4 counter sheets were glossy and 1 was not. The sheet with the English and with the French satellite units, not glossy, as you can see, not nearly as shiny as the French. Not a big deal, but I thought I'll bring that up. Also, just the quality, the art is very impressive. For example, if you look at the pool of French satellite units, you will notice that different nationalities, the art has shows different uniforms. This attention to detail really tells you sometimes. You know, when you wait for 40 years, you have a long time to really spend a lot of love to develop and redevelop your original game. So really interesting, really high quality counters here. Now, when you put them on the map, as you can see, they fill the hex in which they go quite tightly. Unless you're going to disperse your units so that you can grab them more easily, although that may make not a lot of sense depending on the circumstances, like so. When you have stacks of units that are next to each other, then you really are gonna need tweezers to move these units around, or you need to be super careful, or again, and this is what I mentioned briefly earlier, you're gonna use these leader displays, which add even more table room required, but it's so much easier if the units are placed, of course, on the corresponding box, like so. And then, of course, only the corresponding leader actually goes on the board to mark the position of those forces. It's also very nice because this way, at a glance, you know exactly which units are with that leader. You don't have to look through the stack because there's a lot of information there that's very important. What you have, of course, is the strength points here in the bottom right corner. The art and a letter here will tell you the type of unit. The flag tells you the allegiance. And that number of stars there, and of course, unless you have a microscope as you're playing, or a telescope or whatever, sometimes it can be tricky to see those, but you'll become familiar with that. But the number of stars there, that indicates the morale of the unit, which can be between 0 and 3, and that's very important. Again, a lot of those problems are solved by placing the units attached to a leader on the leader display. Make sure that the table that you're using is really, really big. So, as for how the heck do we play? Well, that depends on the scenario. Again, I'm only going to talk about the scenarios. You choose one, you set up the game accordingly. For the scenarios, you will only use part of the board, which part depends on the scenario, if it's the Peninsular War, the Russian campaign, the Austerlitz campaign, etc., etc., etc. That will also tell you not just who is there at the beginning of the game, or the scenario, but also potentially which nationalities may enter depending on certain events, on things that may or may not be triggered. When it comes to the main sequence of play, we are going to start each turn by an attrition phase. On one hand, of course, like in so many other games, you will have an advantage if you pile up monster armies, because then you just smash the opponent. But you're gonna get hungry if you do so. So at the beginning of each turn, if a hex has more than 2 strength points in it, and trust me, that will be very common, then you need to roll on the attrition table. And you know, until it's 6, it's really still okay. The attrition table is pretty simple. For each hex that has more than 2 strength points, you look at the column indicating how many strength points are in there, roll a die, modify the die roll, cross-reference, and you see the negative effect of attrition. You see how many of your people are too hungry to keep going. And the modifiers really make sense contextually. Some units have an easier time finding food around. In Spain and Russia, not so much. Non c'è trippa per gatti there. If you have any Italian friend, they can tell you what that means. So, attrition. And so make sure they don't start too much, but of course, losing some people to attrition and then being able to deliver that powerful blow may still not always be a bad idea. Then we have the alliance phase, in which, again, alliances may shift or change depending on the scenarios and what events have been triggered. Reinforcements and replacements, I think you get a sense of what that means. And then the main heart of the game really is that the French player will execute ground movement and then combat, and then the anti-French player will do the same. So at the core, when you don't pay too much attention, you should, but when you don't get obsessed about the surrounding elements, this is still a game that has a classic flow, I go, you go. Although combat has a couple of interesting twists there when it comes to who does what. Ground movement. Units will move up to the full maximum allowance based on type, and of course the cost will depend on the terrain of the areas that you're entering, the borders that you're crossing. Cavalry can move by itself, but infantry cannot. It needs to be moved with leaders, by leaders, stacked with leaders. Leaders have a movement value of 10, Wellington and Napoleon 12, because those are smart guys. So you move your units in stacks, and after that you can declare combat. As you can see, with my big fingers, and I'm not a big fan of tweezers, it can be tricky. When you declare combat, regardless of situation, the first declaration of combat, the first round of combat, is always between one hex and another hex, regardless of units that may be adjacent to those two hexes. It's still 1 against 1. What is interesting is that then you have the beautiful element of marching to the sound of the guns. That is, after that round of combat has been resolved, and possible withdrawals, losses, demoralization, all that has been applied, then the players can try to bring in forces from adjacent hexes. You need to roll a die, you're going to have a modifier possibly based on the value of the leader, and once all is said and done, if your check is successful, then you're able to perform another round of combat in which more people will be there, and so people can join that area, leave, enter later, and after a round of combat, the attacked may become the attacker, launch a counter attack, and basically players can go back and forth until they're both done attacking and counter-attacking, and or one of the two sides is simply not there anymore because of losses and or withdrawals. As for combat, unusually, that's a combat odd situation, but unusually you don't have attacker divided, the strength of the attacker divided by the strength of the defender, which sometimes will be a positive 2-to-1, 3-to-1, sometimes a negative 1-to-2, etc. The combat odds is always the largest force, regardless of attacker defender role, divided by the strength of the lowest force, and so it will always be a positive ratio with a minimum 1-to-1 because we're always dividing the large by the small. Once you have that ratio, you will roll the dice, you will modify that based on leader values. Morale, remember those teeny tiny stars? The total morale of your force will be the morale of the morale level that is contributing the most strength points to a battle. So most of my strength points in a battle have a morale of 2 because they have 2 stars, then my morale in that battle is 2. You add the morale of the highest of the largest force, subtract the morale of the smaller force, possibly apply terrain effects. If you're using tactical optional rules, apply those also. And once you cross-reference that with the odds ratio, then you will have the results, which are up here. The results will be 1 for the large force and 1 for the small force, larger and smaller. It can be a 1, a D1, a D2, a D3. 0 means no appreciable effects or results or losses. Once each side has their own result, which will be a 1, a D2, or a D2, or a D3. By the way, this D results will also cause demoralization, which means you will add the corresponding marker to the stack that suffers that result. That will lower the morale of your force. Say I was morale 2, I get a D1, now it counts as a D1. Sorry, as a morale 1, and those are cumulative. Next turn I get another 1, 1 and 1 is 2, my morale was 2, now is 0, and now I am leaving there and withdrawing. That's for the D1, but remember, on top of the demoralization, those results tell you which line you should use here. You cross-reference the line that you received here, remember that part? You cross-reference that result, which tells you the line which the total strength of the smaller force is always that is used to calculate actual losses, regardless of whether you are the smaller or the largest. So, for example, we are fighting against a smaller force of 11, and somebody had a 1, then they lose 2 strength points. Somebody had a D1, then they lose these many strength points. And then there will be rules, of course, about who takes that damage. Again, possible withdrawals. If a city is involved, then there may be a siege because people that are in that area may choose to fight in front of the city, retreat inside the city, then there may be a siege. There's a procedure for that in which you're sitting, if there are people inside the city and no forces from the same side in the same hex marked as outside of the city, then you, the attacker, can sit on top of that hex, and each round there's a chance that the besieged will surrender and they're simply eliminated from the board. But this is the general idea, really. Couple of checks, the most important of which is supply and attrition, and then I go, you go. I go, I'll move everybody, I attack, I launch the first round of attacks, but then we counterattacked, and then the other player does the same. They move and they start launching attacks, but they may be counterattacked. Continue like this turn after turn until one of the players have fulfilled the objectives of the scenario, which can be very, very different from one another because the scenarios indeed depict different situations and there's huge variety there. War and Peace has to be one of the most flexible, one of the most replayable, one of the most sandboxy war games that I've ever played. To me, it's up there with Unconditional Surrender, which is a game that, if you're on a desert island, there's just so much that you can do with that one. War and Peace even more so, because the equivalent of Unconditional Surrender would be the campaign game. Here also you have all of these scenarios, and I play several of them and they play so differently, and yet they all really capture the specific period of the Napoleonic age that they portray. They were different dynamics, different objectives, different forces, different diplomatic elements. I can't wait until retire for so many reasons, and now in that list I also add the campaign game for War and Peace. Really, this is one of those desert island games. If you find yourself on the desert island, you only have one, so it's not just about that game being a blast for that one time, it's about that long relationship. I think you'd be fine with War and Peace if you like war games, of course. You can also play by yourself, so that is great. And that's how I played it. Play solitaire, taking my own time, really getting to enjoy the pace, the options, etc., etc., etc. I like it a lot. So replay value is off the charts, and play value, of course, because what's the point of replay value if play is not great? Play is very strong. Gameplay is very strong because it's so simple, it's so straightforward. Don't be scared by all of those extra rules about the scenarios. The core is you do a little bit of things here and there, move, launch, attacks, move, the opponent moves, launches, attacks. And if you're playing with a human opponent, that's also great because, of course, it's I go, you go. Very often that creates some downtime, but during the I attack, then you can counterattack, so the opponent will still be involved there. And it doesn't get too confusing because of that. Actually, I like the fact that there is a mounting sense of a momentous situation that builds up as people bring in reinforcements, or try to, and that's also fascinating. There's a situation that was set up in a certain way, but because of crazy die rolls, the reinforcements fail to arrive. They arrive too late. By the time they arrive, the original people have been crushed, and does it even make sense for you to bring them there? So you're gonna have to withdraw. So actually, this back and forth may feel a bit confusing, even when I read the rule book. And the rule book, it's solid, but somehow that phase felt confusing. But then you just set up the game, you start playing it. Oh, of course, I just go back and forth as I want. But that opens the possibility to so many branching decisions about, again, who attacks whom for the first round of combat, who is going to reinforce or try to reinforce, who is going to withdraw, and are you going to be outside the city, inside the city? That is an option, etc., etc., etc. It gives you that sense of the operational nature of Napoleonic warfares, with different groups being not too far from one another, far enough that they can live off the land, and here the attrition rules really encourage you to play in that sense historically, but then still in a way that when the action starts, there is a possibility of regrouping. And so just so many different things. Of course, you can just say, I'm going to pile up everything here, everybody here, and I'm going to take that attrition, I'm going to just try to cut a wedge through the enemy defenses. So the action really is interesting and intriguing because on one hand, you get the sense that good strategy is rewarded, but on the other hand, there is that element of luck when it comes to reinforcements, let alone that when it comes to combat, of course. And that gives you the sense, of course, of the Clausewitzian fog of war, attrition, friction. Everything that can go wrong will go gloriously wrong. And again, that struggle of the human mind over brute matter and against the blind lady luck. It is a game that to me does what war games should do. In a sense, is one of these quintessential war games because it's very simple at its core, but it's oozing with historical flavor, partially scripted in the rules of the scenarios, but even better, hardwired in the mechanics of the game, so that simply by following the rules and trying to maximize your options within the rules, you are playing historically. You are playing in a way that mirrors historical dynamics. You feel that you're there, you feel that you're seeing all of these situations from the Peninsular War to the Russian campaign. You enter a parallel world. It's a Napoleonic age in a box, and that to me is very, very impressive. It is an impressive achievement. I guess there is a reason why this game had been so popular for the last decades, and it's definitely nice to see that there's a version here. It's the first one that I play, so I cannot compare, but it's a really remarkable game from the point of view of production. Again, if I could ask for anything, I like bigger hexes, but then the map would become so big that I don't know that I could physically play it. As is, you have a game that looks stunning and it's still very playable because actually each scenario will only occupy part of the map. It will not have a huge amount of counters, so it's very manageable, which also means that the flow of the game, even if some of the battles may be long, they start as a battle, turns into a campaign, yet the game will move fast because you never have a huge amount of counters on the board, again, in the scenarios. Really impressive, the kind of game that if I had the time, again, I would play the campaign, I would just be playing the scenarios over and over again, which also means it's a game that's going to give you a huge value for your money because there's just so much you can get out of it. War and Peace, a truly remarkable game. Huge replay value, strong play value, very, very solid design. Beautiful, fun, infinitely replayable. I'm really, really impressed with this one.